Now, Joel, at the end of the book of Genesis, you had this big family reunion of Jacob and his family in Egypt. Then Jacob dies, they take him home, Joseph dies, and whoops, suddenly we start off in Exodus and the whole people is enslaved. How do they get to be slaves?
In the beginning of Exodus, there is this notice that after the death of Joseph and his brothers and that whole generation, a new Pharaoh arose who didn't know Joseph. Mm-hmm. And it seems that his first act is, now that we have a new generation, he looked around and he thought, boy, there's awful lot of Israelites in Egypt right now. And we have to remember that back at the very end of Genesis, we are told that even before Jacob dies, right, that the people multiply and increase greatly, right, in sort of fulfillment of that classical be fruitful and multiply line from Genesis 1. The people do exactly that. So the Israelites are not just the few people of Jacob and his family, they are now evidently some sort of substantial population. And with the turning over of a new generation, I feel like the Pharaoh looked around and thought, I'm a little uncomfortable with just how many Israelites seem to be here, and probably also with the status that they seem to hold for themselves. You know, Joseph had been essentially second in command. Yeah. And a Pharaoh who had not obligated to Joseph at all might be a little bit wary of that situation. I don't mean to excuse the enslavement, but I think that that's the impetus for it is there are just too many Israelites, right? It is effectively, it's population control.
Yeah, there is a phenomenon here that will come up again from time to time in the Old Testament, that it's the very success of the people, and of course the fact that they are a discrete block, and they don't assimilate into Egypt. But there is a certain irony, it seems to me, in the enslavement, because when Joseph was riding high, one of the things that he does is make all the Egyptians slaves to Pharaoh. So, he has set a precedent for it. And actually the Bible is a little roller coaster of things like this. You solve one problem, and in the process of it, you create another one. And then to the rescue comes Moses.
Right.
Now, talking about tall tales in the Bible, what do you make of the story of the birth of Moses?
Well, it's such an interesting story, not only because, we love the story, right? The mother putting him in the basket, and because she's trying to avoid having to kill him according with Pharaoh's decree. And then he's picked up by the princess who raises him in the palace. It really looks a lot like a mechanism for explaining Moses' name, right? The name Moses is given to him not by his mother, but by the daughter of Pharaoh.
And it is at least an element in a lot of Egyptian names.
It is.
It not?
I think it's decidedly an Egyptian name, right? This is the name Moses that we know from Tutmosis, from Ramesses, right? It's the same ending, right? It means son of. It means born to.
Now, the story that you get in Exodus tries to explain this with them being taken out of the Nile. Mm-hmm. Is that a real etymology of the name?
No. Actually, if it was going to be, right, the Hebrew word, in Hebrew his name is Moshe. In Hebrew the verb to draw something out is mashah. But if Moshe is from that, it means he's the one who does the drawing rather than being the one who gets drawn. Yeah. So my sense is this is a classic, what we call a false etymology, which happens almost everywhere in the Bible. Almost every name etymology in the Bible is false this way. It's an attempt to explain a name on the basis of a story, as opposed to however it may have come about. In this case, it being Egyptian.
So now we have Moses growing up in the lap of luxury in the court of Pharaoh. Why doesn't he just stay there and become the new Joseph, so to speak, and be viceroy of Egypt and succeed the Pharaoh when he dies and whatever? What happens to him?
He seems to have some sort of innate sense of his own ethnic past. Right? Famously, he goes out and he sees the Egyptian beating the Israelite, and he is suddenly emotionally worked up about it.
Now, would you figure from that it must be a sense of his own ethnic past? He wouldn't have gotten worked up if he just saw somebody beating an Israelite unless he happened to be an Israelite himself.
The question, I think, is, was this really the first time he saw an Egyptian beating an Israelite? Right? If he has been growing up in Pharaoh's court, presumably this is the kind of thing he's encountered before.
Maybe he reached a tipping point.
Maybe.
This was the blow that broke the camel's back, so to speak. And
In any case, whatever it was, this is what drives him out of Egypt, right? Is this this initial rebellious act?
Yes, and he sets a great precedent, doesn't he, for how should you deal with oppression?
Mm-hmm. Right. This is clearly the kernel of what he then goes on to do later on. In some sense, the question of why Moses is the one who liberates the Israelites, I think this story is meant to be an explanation. Right? Moses is the one who liberates the Israelites because Moses is the one who we know is capable of acting.
Although I would say also that this is exceptional. You know, that later on when Pharaoh is pursuing them, he doesn't set an ambush. You know, this is the one case where he actually takes things into his own hands and kills somebody. Mm-hmm. But it's interesting to have it in there.
I agree.
I think maybe we'll circle back to that issue a bit. But he goes off, he finds himself in Midian.
Right. Where is Midian?
Well, it's way the hell over. Not in the Sinai Peninsula, not in that carrot that hangs down, you know, where we usually think of Mount Sinai, but across another body of water, off over directly south of Israel. And this then begins to look suspicious. Now, what he'll find there is a bush, a Sinai, which is surely a play on the name of Sinai.
Surely it is.
And also we'll find with Sinai, there are a lot of passages in the Bible that talk about Yahweh coming from the south.
Mm-hmm. Coming from Sinai.
And coming from Sinai, yeah. And so there seems to be a tradition of Yahweh being a God who revealed himself on Mount Sinai that was independent of the story of the Exodus. Now, this at least has often been argued, that you have two traditions here, one of them about the Exodus, another one of God revealing himself on Mount Sinai. And in order to put those together, you've got to take people on quite a journey.
That's right.
You've got to take them way out of their way.
Right, and Moses' trip to Midian is the first sort of leg of that trip, right? He makes it in advance, and then he'll take the Israelites back on the way that he went when he was a younger man.
Yeah, but he got his exercise.
He certainly did.
There.
Midian is not the most obvious place to run away.
Yeah.
It is quite some distance.
Yeah. Now, when he's there, then he sees this bush, and he gets this strange voice calling to him out of the bush. And when he asks for a name, the answer that he gets is, at least what it looks like is, I am who I am. Is this just an evasive answer?
It is a mysterious answer, to be sure. It's one that has caused a lot of consternation in scholarship. The number of scholarly articles that are written on this verse may be as great as have been written on any other single verse. What does God mean when he says, Ehyeh, Asher Ehyeh, I am what I am, or I am who I am, or I will be what I will be? I mean, we don't even know exactly how to take it.
Could even be I used to be who I used to be.
It could be. It could be. I continue to be who I may have once been.
Yes.
It's nostalgia for lost youth. What I think we probably have here is really no more than a pun, right? This is God, whose name is Yahweh, making a sort of something of a joke, right? You're asking me my name, Ehyeh, right? I am who I am. And then he goes on to say, right, when the Israelites ask you who sent you, you say, Ehyeh. Tell them Yahweh sent you. Right? He explains the joke. He explains the pun. I think we're just not comfortable with God joking. But I think if we think for a second about how the name is constructed, right, Yahweh, the name of Israel's God, is a third-person verb. he who causes to be, perhaps. So this is what an Israelite would call God, right? God is he who causes to be.
Yeah.
What's God going to call himself? I am, right? He
Right.
changes it to the first person, which is exactly what Ehya is. So I think we need to probably, take it a little easier with this, not worry so much about it. The text itself explains that it's a pun, but it is certainly a mysterious kind of moment.
Now, when this was translated into Greek, it was rendered as Emi Ha'on. I am the one who is. And you often get this in modern translations, I am who am, as an assertion of absolute being. And the providential thing, if you like, about this is that when they encountered Greek philosophy, they found that there was a lot of speculation about being with a capital B. And you could make a case that all of Western, certainly Christian philosophy and theology was built on the assumption that the God of the Exodus is the same as absolute being. Now, this is certainly nothing you could have imagined in Hebrew. I don't know that you could have expressed it in Hebrew. You wouldn't want to have expressed it the way you get it in Exodus anyway.
No, I don't think.
Now, I suppose Christian theologians would think of this as what we call a felix culpa, a happy fault, a mistaken translation that was a new revelation in itself. One could, I suppose, also take a less charitable view of it, but we'll let that be.
Yeah.
Now, does this God at all reveal anything important about himself? With this, apart from joking about his name, what is there in the story that tells us what this God is about?
Well, I mean, the real revelation here is the name itself, right? That is, in the story of Exodus 3, when Moses says, "What do I call you?" I think it's a genuine question, because according to this story, and here we have to talk somewhat about, again, the sources, the three sources of the Exodus story. According to this story, which is from the E source, nobody has known God's name to this point. So this is a real moment of God revealing more about himself in the name, which in the ancient world, names were powerful things, right? Names were really a description of your essence in some way, maybe not in the Greek philosophical way, but they had power beyond mere identification. So to know God's name is to become much closer to God, a much closer relationship than I think was previously the case. So E tells us in Exodus 3 that God for the first time reveals his true name to Moses and to the Israelites.
And doesn't do it very directly.
On the contrary, when we come to chapter 6, where we sort of have the exact same scene again. Once again, God comes to Moses and says, "I'm going to tell you my real name," which no one knew before. This is one of these classic sort of doublets and contradictions in the text.
And this time he actually comes right out and
says it.
Tell them Yahweh.
That's right. He says, right before this, I revealed myself to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as El Shaddai, right? How would you translate El Shaddai? The God Almighty.
God Almighty, often probably God of the mountains.
Probably originally.
Like that explanation.
But indeed, in Genesis, God, in the priestly source, reveals himself as El Shaddai repeatedly. And now he comes in Exodus in 6 to Moses and says, "I used to be El Shaddai. Now you can call me Yahweh."
Now, there are two aspects, I think, of this revelation that one might think about. On the one hand, he is saying, I am actually the same God that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were dealing with. Now, this wouldn't at all have been obvious. After all, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob weren't on Mount Sinai.
Right.
So it's making a connection there, and it's claiming for this God a certain history. But you could say that in later tradition, what's really taken as the essence of the revelation of God here is that he brings them out of slavery in the land of Egypt. And what are we going to make of that? Is this a God who is, this is a passage that's greatly beloved of liberation theologians. And should we take this as a paradigm that God is on the side of the oppressed, that God is committed to liberating people from slavery.
I think as nice as that reading is, as much as we'd like it to say that, I think it's a hard one to maintain in the face of a couple of other issues. First of all, it seems to me that when we get further along into the laws, which we'll get to eventually, there are laws that say things like, now when you own a slave, here's how you treat it. And
Indeed.
actually, some of the ways that you treat it
Yes.
are not so great. In other words, the Israelites are looking forward, in some senses, to being liberated from slavery so that they can have their own slaves.
So that they can have their own slaves, yes.
And there's also, so that's one direction. The other one is the Israelites are being liberated from slavery to the Egyptians so that they can effectively be enslaved to God, right? Which it says quite explicitly, right? You will be, right, my servants.
You will be my slaves. Is that the same kind of thing? Is it the same kind of slavery?
It's not the same kind of slavery insofar as it's not oppressive, but it is the same sort of master-servant relationship, I think.
Well, you know, it's certainly true, I think, that Exodus isn't promoting an idea of liberal democracy or anything of that sort. You know, this is all in the context of a very traditional kind of society. And it isn't actually changing the structures of society.
Not at all.
But at the same time, I think one can reasonably infer that, you know, what you're being liberated from does matter. And you know, whether it matters as much as what for, I think you can't really neglect either side of that equation. And there is, I think, an admission in the story then that slavery, at least the kind of slavery they had in the land of Egypt, was a bad thing, and that it was good to be liberated from it. So I think there's a certain legitimacy to appropriating the story and extending it.
I think that you're right that there's different kinds of slavery, but I would also think we have to take into consideration that it is also a specific people, right? God is liberating Israel from slavery.
So, I mean, if you push that idea, you would be saying, and Christians shouldn't be bothering with this stuff at all, right? This is the story of Israel, and it only relates to us back to this people. So
I don't think you would say that, John.
No, I wouldn't, but I'm pressing you first to see whether you would. Because I know one of your teachers would.
One of my teachers, right. One of my teachers, John Levinson, certainly would say that.
But you know, it touches on a question of how you take a story that was written for one specific kind of situation, and whether you can then apply that in a quite different situation, and draw analogies from it. You know, are you bound in the end by, if we can talk about the original intention of a text, although texts don't really have intentions, but the implication of the text in its original context? Or can you take that out and say by analogy, so that you might even say that even though the Israelites were quick to get their own slaves, they really shouldn't have if they were following through the story to its logical conclusion?
I think that what I would say is it is perfectly acceptable to broaden as long as you're conscious of the fact that you're doing the broadening.
That's right. That's right, yeah. I would agree with that. As another scholar, Jonathan Boyarin, put it, that the Exodus doesn't really impose a theology on you, that it's available for effective rhetoric. And I think that's really why this story has had such appeal to people, is because people do read it and identify with the slaves, even if they're not people of Israel. In fact, people do use it that way.
Sure.
Now, I'd say they're also selective in how they use the story, and they don't always follow it through to the conclusion. But it is a matter of how you use the story. It's not that the story imposes this theology on you.
Right.
So on a note of agreement,
Indeed.
we'll leave that topic here. Right.